Hello, and welcome back to the Argyle Digital CFO Leadership Forum. My name is Brittany Sullivan with Argyle. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our esteemed speaker. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat, and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Sal Visca, Chief Technology Officer at Vertex. We are excited to have Sal with us for his thought leadership titled Modernizing, Transforming, and Innovating Tax and Finance. Welcome, Sal, and over to you.
Thanks, Brittany. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the metaverse, as we all seem to be living in these days. You don't often hear innovation going along with tax and finance, but I think we're at an interesting time in society and life and technology. So with that, we just want to spend the next 20, 25 minutes talking about some of the things that we see at Vertex and leave 5 minutes or so for questions. And if we don't get to all the questions, we'll follow up with people. So I encourage you to kind of think through as we're talking through these kinds of transformations, the kinds of questions you might have. So as Brittany mentioned, I am the Chief Technology Officer. Not to be confused with Chief Tax Officer, which we also have at Vertex. So I always say I'm the other CTO. I joined Vertex just under a year ago. I came out of the e-commerce platform market. Prior to that, I had been at SAP. I was CTO of the business intelligence division that formed from SAP's acquisition of Business Objects, where I had been CTO for several years, as we were building kind of next generation intelligence and insights and what we call systems of insight, helped develop some of the HANA in-memory analytics engines and that kind of thing. Prior to that, I did some startup stuff, and then I was at IBM for about 12 years. But I'm thrilled to be at Vertex as we look to really reimagine a lot of the next wave of technology and how it applies to the world of tax and finance. So, I'm not going to drone on about change is constant, but as we have all been living the last couple of years, we're living through a lot of change and an accelerated amount of change. There's a quote here from Peter Drucker that I really like, and it's really about focusing on the fact that there's always going to be turbulence, there's always going to be change. How we address that change is really the difference. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking ahead. And as I'm actually Canadian, I'm living in the US now, but as a good Canadian once said, skate to where the puck is going. The great Wayne Gretzky was always looking at the situation and looking for where things were going and trying to move there. And I think we all need to do that in our lives and in our careers. And we think it's a good time for us to do that within the space of tax and finance. The current landscape is, with all the organizational issues we're going through, with all the great resignation or the great rotation, as I actually call it, of people and staff. We're all working, a lot of us are working remote, trying to find hybrid environments of working. We're all dealing with old financial systems that were built for potentially a different time that have dragged on in some way. We're working in a world where jurisdictions and legislation is changing faster than ever. So obviously you can't have a presentation these days without talking about COVID, but I don't really want to spend time talking about that specifically, other than the catalyst it has been. It has driven us to become digital first. And I think that's a really important term. When, like we say here, 58% of customer interactions and up to 70, 80% and more in some cases, interactions are digital these days, up from significantly lower than that when we had more of a hybrid environment. It's really straining our systems to be able to deal with a different type of interaction model. And so obviously a lot of IT organizations, a lot of companies, a lot of enterprises are looking for ways to deal with this new reality. And a lot of what we're doing at Vertex is trying to help enable business leaders in finance and in tax and working with IT groups to really be ready for the kinds of changes that are needed to support this ever changing and ever more complex world we're in. So I'm just going to jump through a few slides here rather than just kind of go through all the specific details of it. But this is some information from KPMG, one of our partners, just in terms of the legislative changes. So it's one thing to be dealing with all of the digital first and this great resignation and all the financial systems and the older technology we have. we're also dealing with a huge amount of change on a regulatory front. Obviously, indirect tax, as opposed to income tax, is an area that a lot of economies and governments are tapping into to fund a lot of the massive deficits that have been built up over years, and especially over the last couple of years through a pandemic. So, this report talks about how there's, essentially 90 different indirect tax regulations going on in 90 different countries, another 12 or so coming. But clearly there's a lot of jurisdictions with a lot of changes, which makes it harder as we have transactions occurring in many different places, cross-border types of activity, what all that means. And it always takes quite some time for the legislation to really catch up. So when you start to look at all of these technology challenges, the economic challenges, the challenges we're all dealing with as humans, and then look at all the kind of business challenges that go along with that. And obviously, in some ways, this new world that we're living in, this more digital world, has really leveled the playing field for a lot of providers. And so the companies that we used to compete with are still there, but then a lot of other potential competitors are in the market because they're, in a digital first world, competitors can come from anywhere. So when you have this increased competition, it's going to put more pressure on you as an organization to be able to compete more effectively. Obviously, the pace of change and the pace of technology that we're all living is accelerating, and it's putting more and more pressures. And again, a lot of the systems we put in place, a lot of the processes we put in place over the years, the methodologies, they're being strained. Again, we're not necessarily always keeping up. We talk again about the kinds of changes that have occurred through a pandemic, and how we've gone through 7+ years of digital transformation in a couple of years. Everything has been pushed harder when you live in a digital first world, and we are trying to all catch up. We're trying to catch our breath. We're trying to get ahead of it. It's hard enough to go where the puck is today, let alone where the puck is going to be. So we all need to work together on this. None of us have the exact answers. This whole issue with staffing and resources, it's happening around the world. We do development around the world, and we have staffing challenges everywhere. And it's not just in the US, it's not just in North America, it's not just in Europe, it's everywhere. So with all that accelerating change is also the fact that we have been building up what we call tech debt, which is really taking shortcuts as we implement things along the way. And over time, you build up a deficit of things that you should have done, and what I sometimes call technology hygiene from a product standpoint, from an architecture standpoint. And it's hard to move quickly when you're working with old monolithic technologies that did the job very well, but were hard to change. And when your business processes are changing and new staff is coming in, those kinds of limitations in your solutions can really make it difficult to move. And we really want, what I often say, technical agility to enable business agility. If the technology that you have in place isn't able to help you support your new business models, your expanding business models, your challenges, then it's just going to be an anchor and it's going to slow you down. So go forward here. So just like every part of technology, tax and finance, which often, as you well know, probably a lot of the audience come from the financial space, and maybe some specifically from the tax space. These are two areas that often are underserved in an organization. When I was at SAP, I was helping build the technology platform that enabled all the applications and the ABAP programs to run to enable businesses to do order entry and logistics and all these kinds of things. And a lot of times our applications for the office of the CFO, as we say, often came later, and they often were more of an afterthought. And I think we all recognize, as we're selling more, the need for reconciliation, bringing all these things together, making sure we're complying with all the appropriate rules is just getting more and more complex again. So there's a quote here from Deloitte, again, another one of our partners from quite some time ago, in terms of defining what that type of transformation is. And it really is a combination of organization and process and technology and all the data that comes with that. So I think we're on the verge of all of these things coming together and pushing us very hard. I think a lot of our enterprises, a lot of our organizations are trying to do what we can with the technologies we have, with the processes we have, and then deal with situations as they come up, whether you're being audited after the fact or trying to reconcile, trying to deal with those exceptions. But that's obviously not a scalable way to go. So we need to institutionalize a lot of that capability, a lot of that flexibility. We need to really start to get deep into automation. We talk a lot about automation these days, and using technologies like machine learning and robotic process automation, RPA, really helps reduce the monotony of work and the manual processing, and allows our teams to really focus in on the value add. And sometimes people get concerned about the concern that we're going to take the human out and the robots are going to take over. That's clearly not the case. We talk more about augmented intelligence, not just artificial intelligence. It's really augmenting the human processes that we have. Again, trying to reduce the human error. We all make errors, especially when there's monotonous work that's very repetitive and a lot of duplication there. So there's a real opportunity for us to leverage technology to make our jobs easier in general, and very specifically in tax and finance, making sure that our business processes are supported by these technologies. If I move forward here, if you kind of look at where tax has come as a specific practice, back in the 70s and 80s, it really was more about the bookkeeping. And again, the bookkeeping kind of came after. You made your sales, they were booked through your ERP system or your mainframes back then. And accounting came by after to make sure that you were collecting and remitting the right amounts of tax and submitting those in and working with the auditors and the jurisdictions to make sure you're all right. Obviously, a lot of manual processing. It was more starting to use technology to enable some of those processes, but still very, very manual. Into the 90s, we started to get into kind of the basic capabilities of tax. And again, coming from SAP and IBM prior to that, we had been trying to bake in all the business processes into the tools. And I don't know if you remember with the old PeopleSoft and Bond days and SAP and all the different solutions, trying to bake in the business processes into those ERP systems was really difficult. And then, your organization would decide on an ERP, you look at your current business processes and you look at the processes that you want to put in place, and it was called business process reengineering. And we tried to do the gap between the as is and the to be models. And we tried to evolve and customize our ERP systems. And we spent, hundreds of millions of dollars with our system integrators to do that. And then ultimately built a system several years later that often didn't really gel with what you needed as an organization. So a lot of learnings came through those days. Going into the 2000s and up to the current kind of time frame, it really is starting to deal with this true global cross-border omni-channel, all these different things we talk about now. Complexity on every vector, on every facet of business has now increased dramatically. And obviously trying to use more of the tooling. Cloud has been a big mover for all of us as we start to become putting our workloads, not just in a cloud environment for an economy of scale, but having one system of truth, one system of record that we could all work with. Using new technologies, like I mentioned earlier, robotic process automation in general, taking things that we need to do that sometimes we use business process outsourcing or optimization for, are now instituting that into the software, making sure that we can capture those business processes and have them done by the systems. Analytics, when I came from business objects in SAP, analytics in the old days were really about reporting. And it's what, rear view mirror of what had happened, and trying to give the business leaders a view of what happened and helping them try to make decisions about improving things going forward. And then we started to change into more analytical applications. We started to look into more real-time decision-making types of environments where the data was coming into the decision process. And we started to see in the 2000s to the current time frame, more the systems helping guide those strategic decision-making processes. Now, as we've talked about, there's a real opportunity, and the word transformation gets used a lot, but there are some significant transformations possible here. This whole digital first world that we live in is really pushing us to develop systems that can work, in a hybrid environment as well, but can deal with these environments where a lot of transactions are happening through the ether, through the metaverse, as I mentioned at the beginning. So, we're doing a lot of work around things like edge computing and containerization to make sure that we're able to take the business process and the data and make sure it's available wherever it needs to be. Of course, we're going to have our true multi-tenanted cloud that can work and be accessed anywhere and has replication around the globe. But we also have to work within the constraints of the kinds of environments we live in with latency and performance and these things. We want to make sure that we are not getting in the way of those transactions. So how do we move now into more, how do we get into, I think we all understand the need for transformation. We understand the evolving landscape, the complexity of the landscape. How do we start to really move forward? And again, a half an hour presentation is not a lot for us to go into, but I just want to start to help maybe shape some of your thinking as you're looking at this problem space. We don't want to get overwhelmed with it. It can be a very overwhelming thing. We want to break it down and figure out how to start to move forward in some ways. So obviously, as a finance group, as a tax group, you're very focused in on the domain of finance, the domain of tax. It's the technology geeks like myself and others that, we're here to try to bring the technology to help us drive the business process. So partner up with your chief technology officer and your chief tax officer, if you have one, your chief information officer, and IT generally. Leverage the tools to be able to help, catalyze your organization and go from being just a technology-enabled business to a company that really can leverage that technology to make some significant changes. So, in terms of going to where the puck is going to be, we do have to think forward. We have to think about, what we're living in today, but not just solve the current problems, solve the problems for where we're going. And again, nothing's going to slow down. We know that. If anything, I think this pandemic that we've gone through has given us pause. It's made us think about where things are going, and in a lot of ways is given our IT organizations even a little bit of a breath, other than trying to deal with remote workforces, to kind of start to think about where the tech needs to go and start to make the investments today that will support us going forward. So the integration of all these platforms and systems and solutions, whether you're using companies like solutions like Vertex, or some of our partners like Oracle or SAP, finding those best of breed solutions that work for you, starting to move slowly, because you can't just rip and replace a lot of these solutions. Sometimes you have to have a smooth, slow, steady transformation through all of this. So we are there, our partners are there to support you in these things, to provide hopefully best practices, things we've seen in other places. As we start to build this transformation together and start to consolidate it in our cloud offerings and start to build these kind of business processes as automation, getting the economies of scale for that scalability and flexibility and security and reliability and all the things we need, and really helping go from where we are today to where we need to go, as we say here, post-implementation. So again, if you're using something like an Oracle Financials and moving to Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, OCI, is a great starting point to start to move those workloads in, start to bring your tax capabilities co-resident with your ERP financial systems, and again, starting to leverage the technology to support a lot of that. So as we start to go into the wind up for the prepared part of the presentation here, just want to leave you with some of the kinds of questions. And again, these are not comprehensive or exhaustive. They really are to try to give you an idea of the kinds of things to be thinking through, to be partnering with your IT organizations for. But of course, any project, you want to be very clear about how you're measuring things, what you're measuring, making sure that everything that you're doing is measurable. Otherwise, you have to kind of ask why you're doing it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, this is not just a rip and replace. It'd be great if we could just start from scratch and put in a brand new system and work off of that. We have the technology side of that, but we also have the people side of that. One thing I've learned over the years, as great as the technology can be, if you're not bringing the staff along to be part of it, it's very difficult. So we mentioned it's not just about the transformation, but innovation. And innovation is hard to do. Reimagination is hard to do in general. And it's particularly hard when you have all the challenges and constraints of your business slowing you down. But it's important to think about that. It's important to look up at the horizon. At Vertex, we talk a lot about Horizon 1, 2, and 3, and we're very inundated with all the work we're doing in Horizon 1, but lifting our heads up to look at the event horizons above us and in front of us to make sure that we're making decisions today in the context of where we're trying to go. And it's hard to remind ourselves of that. So then, in terms of reporting and responsibility and RACI, who's responsible, who's accountable, who should be consulted, all those kinds of things, you need to really set up yourself for success. And again, system integrators are very good at doing this and helping put in, KPIs and, OKRs for objectives and key results and these kinds of things, and aligning the organization behind these transformations. You can't just say, this is where we're going to go. You need to have a good management structure around it. And then, of course, like any project, make sure you have the right stakeholders. Again, technology and business, finance, marketing. In a lot of cases, it tends to be quite cross-functional. So you need to decide for your organization what's right to do there. So as we kind of wrap up here, this is not a commercial. Vertex is here, been here for 40 years. I've been here for a year. I'm amazed at the depth of capability and expertise that has been developed. We have 4,000, really significant customers. 59% of the Fortune 500 are customers. And this cross-country, 130 countries and growing, is pretty impressive. The number of rules that we're able to manage and deal with, and the complexity. Complexity has been our friend. Complexity is something that Vertex handles extremely well. And I see that in my first year here, and I think there's a lot of value that we can bring to our customers and our partners in supporting that. So just as a kind of a final slide, we often talk about Vertex being essentially at the center of all the commerce transactions and making sure there's compliance and you're filing, you're remitting, all these things. One thing I talk a lot about is follow the money. Commerce transactions are occurring everywhere. It used to be you would put an order entry and financials through your ERP system, and that was your primary way. Then e-commerce, obviously in this more digital first world, B2C, business to consumer, business to business to consumer, marketplaces, procurement, billing, supply chain, all of these business processes and areas are driving transactions, and a lot of those transactions generate what I call digital exhaust. That digital exhaust is being captured, and you want to make sure that your compliance systems are collecting all the transaction volume, all the transactions that have been done, making sure you're understanding really what's happening, and you're complying with all of your various systems to make sure that you're collecting tax appropriately, you're remitting it properly in real time, these kinds of things. But then also have these strategic insights to learn from the kind of transactions, really how to better engage with your customers and making sure that things are done properly. So with that, I'm hoping we can kind of get into some questions. Again, half an hour through this virtual world where I'm talking to myself in a screen is hard to know what you are thinking, what you're grappling with. So with that, I don't know, Mark or anyone else, Brittany, if we have questions lined up that we want to get into at this point.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sal, for such an insightful presentation. As a reminder, audience members can still enter questions. We'll go ahead and review a couple that came through. So Sal, our first question, we are struggling to align the goals of IT and finance. What recommendations can you make?
Start off easy. IT is a tough, finance is a tough place to be, IT is a tough place to be. IT is trying to transform as quickly as possible. Just like any two groups that have very different constraints and frustrations and realities, it's hard to find alignment. But obviously, the financial side of the business is quite significant in terms of whether you're a public company or private company, and IT is there as a service organization. It's really to try to make sure there's an understanding of the business value of what's trying to be done. And sometimes business value is compliance and is making sure we're not breaking the rules, we're doing things correctly. But that said, these IT transformations are massive, and they are also trying to build for the future. So there's no really, from my standpoint, there's no easy answer to that one at all, especially two organizations that have the most pressure, I think, in a lot of ways, having to try to align and work together. I wish I had a better answer.
Perfect, thank you. This next question, what are the biggest challenges you've experienced when implementing new finance transformation initiatives?
So, in a finance organization, a lot of times we use the software kind of, out of the box. And we used to talk about vanilla implementations of things like PeopleSoft or SAP, and just relying on those systems to be the best practices and trying to mold our organization's practices to the way the system worked. In the old days, we were trying to do those gap analysis and try to customize the software, which meant we were customizing software that wasn't sustainable to go through upgrades. So, these financial consolidation applications, being able to do kind of not real time, but faster closings and collecting the transactions and making sure that the automation is being done while you're capturing that transaction. It's kind of bringing us to more that real time side of things, where again, in the past, it used to be 30-day, 45-day, 60-day types of cycles. It is trying to shrink that cycle. Because once you have a tighter cycle on that, you're also able to make course corrections along the way and deal with situations. Because once it goes beyond that, it starts to become really expensive to solve after.
Great, thank you. This next question asks, have you experienced any reluctance to change from employees in regard to new technology implementations?
Absolutely. I mean, humans are creatures of habit, and people get concerned about things changing in their jobs. And, we have expertise. We have people that have been doing things for 20, 25, 30 years. One thing we've learned at Vertex, even as we transform some of our tax research, we collect changes around the world in tax legislation, and we have teams of people that are just working with the different jurisdictions to collect that information. I think initially there's always that resistance of, oh my God, AI and machine learning is going to take away my job. It's just scan these websites and databases and automatically do the work. We found once we worked with them and showed what the technology can do and allowed them in a lot of cases to do 80% of the more monotonous work, have the technology do it, less errors, bring it to them so that when they focus in on the 20%, it's a much more of the value add, and they're able to get a lot more productive. So there's always going to be resistance to change. If people don't understand what's coming, they resist it even more. So the only recommendation any of us can make a lot of times is to engage them sooner on, help them understand the benefits of it. Now, in some cases, there will be times where those changes are changing things dramatically for them, and some people just don't like change. And now, as part of this great rotation, great resignation, we're all losing people that really understand a domain deeply. And it's unfortunate to lose some of those people. So I would suggest engaging them as quickly and as early as possible, help them feel like they're part of the solution.
Great, thank you, Sal. Looks like we have time for one last question. Beyond simply compliance, are there tools to guide transaction structure to yield more tax efficiency?
Yeah, so a lot of what we're doing at Vertex is creating kind of a data platform that is really looking at these transactions and trying to understand the context in which that transaction occurred, the breakup of the mix of products and things that were being sold. And a lot of times when you have bundling of these kinds of things, it becomes really, really complex. So again, transactions used to be a lot simpler. You had an invoice and it had to get processed and all that. Now with things like VAT and e-invoicing and all the things that go along with it, it's become very, very complex. So what we're trying to do at Vertex is create a very granular data model around these things so that we can start to really understand the transaction, the content of it, the context of it, and then be able to collect that. And again, have the system learn from that and be able to auto-correct some things in real time. Because once you learn, when these products are put together, certain products, if you have an exemption, we also deal with things like exemption certificates. Maybe some part of that order is exempt for whatever reason. A lot of times that stuff is found later and you have to go back and reconcile it all. And that reconciliation process is inefficient, error prone, and cost you money, time and money. So for us, we're trying to institute at a much more granular level that intelligence, but a lot of times it comes down to the data versus just saying, it was a €100 charge and there was a €17 tax associated with it, is really understanding the makeup of that transaction.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again, Sal, for such an insightful presentation. I also want to thank everyone who joined us today for this fantastic session. This session, along with all of today's content, will be made available on demand following the event. This does officially conclude the Argyle Digital CFO Leadership Forum. So thank you again to our sponsors, TripActions, UiPath, Divvy, Tipalti, Workiva, and Vertex for partnering with us at today's event. Thank you again for joining us and engaging in our content. Have a great night.